The nanny's son's name appeared in the will, and the family panicked. A forgotten name linked to a woman erased from the house's memory resurfaced at the most unlikely moment, the reading of $1 billion will. Nobody expected that. No one was ready to see a stranger claim a place among the heirs with a legal right to the fortune. The widow turned pale, the eldest son screamed, and then a heavy silence fell over everyone. The signature was legitimate, the value left was real, and the presence of that name was proof that something serious had been hidden for too long. The impact was not just on inheritance, it was in the secret that came with it. The nanny fired without explanation decades ago. The past that the family pretended to forget was now knocking loudly on the door. Who was that boy? Why did the patriarch put him in his will? And what was behind the mother's silence? The sudden dismissal, the hidden pain. The answer was in a handwritten letter and in a reliquary kept for years. Stay until the end of the story. The nanny's son appeared in the billionaire's will. The forbidden secret shocked the entire family. Discover why this inheritance not only changed the destiny of a hidden heir, but undid a family lie built over decades. The truth will give you goosebumps. On the day of the will reading, the registry office's meeting room looked no different from any other, but there was a tense silence in the air. Everyone was present, but eyes avoided each other, and the clock seemed to go back. The absence of that man, whose presence dominated any environment, was now replaced by a pile of documents on the table. He had always been known for his rigidity in business and the meticulous way in which he led his life. When his heart failed without warning, it left behind not just assets and businesses, but a legacy built on discipline and absolute control. And even though the mourning was ongoing, what was in the air at that moment was the concrete expectation for what would come next. For days, the conversation in the house's corridors revolved around figures and speculation. The children were certain that they would receive equal shares. The widow, discreet, kept her gaze fixed on old photos, but inside she was filled with restlessness. The brother-in-law, the deceased's only brother, was fully confident that he would inherit one of the companies. Even the family lawyer showed a slight uneasiness, reviewing the papers more carefully than usual. No one imagined that between those leaves, there was a line capable of destabilizing everything they thought they knew. Even so, they continued with the protocols, without imagining that they were about to discover something that would turn everyone against their own past. When the names in the will were read aloud, the initial reaction was as expected: mentions of the wife, children, and assets to be shared. But it only took a single word spoken outside the norm for the atmosphere to lose its air. A name completely outside the family circle was announced. No one reacted immediately. It was as if the sound had been suspended in time, challenging those present to understand what had been said. The wife stiffened in her chair. The children exchanged disconcerted looks, and the lawyer hesitated, realizing that the moment had come. Inside that envelope, there was not just a will, there was a bomb carefully stored for decades. The name sounded strange to everyone present: Nathan Walker. No one in that room seemed to recognize him, and yet he was there, printed with the same formality as the other heirs. The lawyer's eyes scanned the family's reaction before continuing. The widow pressed her fingers against the bag on her lap. Anna, the youngest daughter, tilted her head, searching for some lost memory. Mark, the firstborn, did not hide the confusion in his eyes. The silence dragged on until the lawyer pulled out a second document, an annex that had been added to the will months before, with a date, notarized signature, and the deceased businessman's own handwriting. It was official. That unknown name had legal weight and the right to what many there thought was exclusively theirs. Before any reaction could be registered, the lawyer resumed reading firmly and revealed that Nathan was, according to the businessman himself, the son of Grace, the woman who had worked as the family's nanny for many years. Surprise turned into tension. The faces that had previously been filled with curiosity gave way to discomfort. Grace had been a constant figure in the house for years, but she was abruptly removed, surrounded by a silence that was never explained. She was dedicated, always present, and treated the children as if they were her own. And now, almost 2 decades later, her name returned to the table carrying an unexpected legacy. Nathan, who no one had seen since he was a child, was about to be publicly recognized by the same family that had closed its doors to him. The impact was immediate. Mark stood up, pushing the chair hard against the floor. His voice came out louder than he expected, filled with indignation and pent-up anger. He demanded explanations, accused the lawyer of bad faith, questioned the veracity of the document, and demanded that the name be removed. The environment became dense. Anna covered her mouth with her hand, scared. The widow kept her eyes downcast, but her face was beginning to lose color. None of those present were prepared for that revelation. Nathan's presence in the will was not just a legal surprise. It was a living reminder of a past that everyone had buried in a hurry. And now, that past returned with force, threatening to destabilize not only the will, but the fragile balance that the family pretended to maintain. The widow kept her eyes fixed on the papers in front of her, trying to maintain the serene posture she had always cultivated. But the slight tremor in her hands and the sudden rigidity in her jaw betrayed a deep discomfort. Grace's name resurfaced like a blade, cutting through a past that she believed closed. She hadn't heard anyone mention her in years. Avoiding her name had been an involuntary strategy within the house, as a defense mechanism to avoid rummaging through what everyone pretended to have forgotten. Still, it was enough for that name to appear for old pains, silent humiliations, and agreements never discussed to return, pulsating beneath the surface of that family that seemed so controlled. If you are enjoying this story and want to continue following narratives like this, full of emotion and twists, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel now. This way, you receive the next stories directly on your YouTube and don't miss any moment that touches your heart. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading, aware that his role there was not to alleviate discomfort. His determination was almost clinical. He announced without changing his tone that Nathan would be entitled to 20% of the total inheritance. The number was not small, it represented millions, and it was not accompanied by justifications or conditional terms. It was recorded in a clear, objective, direct way. That started a new movement within the room. A whisper of shock spread like an electric current. It was a sum that completely altered the balance of power between the heirs. Mark let out a nervous laugh. Anna was looking for some rational explanation. The widow, in silence, just crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself from an impact that was yet to come. The environment fell apart in seconds. The control that the family tried to maintain collapsed in the absence of answers. Mark pointed his finger at the lawyer, demanding a review. Anna questioned the legality of the document. The widow just watched, paler by the minute. Grace's name was mentioned again, first with strangeness, then with veiled accusations, old insinuations that came from the time when she still walked through the corridors of the house with Nathan in her arms. The past that everyone had hidden was now returning in the form of percentages and signatures, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. And in the midst of that chaos, a silent question grew that no one dared to say out loud. Why, after all, had Grace disappeared like that? And why would the businessman, always so reserved, leave so many millions to someone like Nathan? At the time Grace arrived at that house, there was no room for questions. She was a simple young woman, visibly tired, and with a big belly that indicated that the child would be born at any moment. She knocked on the door with silent courage, asking for work, not pity. The house was still under renovation. The youngest baby in the family cried a lot, and no one could organize the routine with 2 young children. The businessman's wife didn't want anything to do with a pregnant employee, but he told her to come in. He said it would be temporary, that it wouldn't hurt to try. The next day, Grace was already washing sheets, serving lunch, and taking care of the boys as if she had known them for years. What was provisional became routine, and the routine became a constant presence, almost invisible, but indispensable. Over time, Grace gained the children's trust before their parents even realized it. They ran into her lap when they were scared, slept better when she told stories, and only ate fruit if she was the one who cut it. She knew the schedules, the quirks, the silences. Even with the limitations of her position, she created an authority that no other employee in the house was able to build. She did this without imposition, just with constancy. She took care of the house, helped with schoolwork, scolded when necessary, and was protective without exaggeration. When Nathan was born, the boss did not hesitate to keep Grace employed. She started sleeping in a small back room and began dividing her time between her own care and that of the family who hired her. With a baby on her lap and 2 others in her hand, she walked through the corridors without ever getting lost. Nathan grew up hearing that this was his home too, even without his last name on the door. He called the boss's wife his aunt and her children his siblings because that was how relationships worked for him. He played in the same garden, ate at the same table when the visit wasn't too formal, and on many mornings he was woken up by Grace's soft voice saying that everyone was waiting. He didn't notice a difference. He wore clothes that came from the boss's children, watched the same cartoons, went to the same doctor. There was something harmonious about that coexistence, even if it was limited by conventions that he did not yet understand. The mistress's gaze no longer followed him with the same warmth as in the early years. Some visitors whispered in the corners when they saw him, and little by little, Nathan began to realize that the house where he was born may never have been completely his, but the breakup was still distant, hidden for a reason that neither of them imagined would one day resurface. It was one weekend that everything changed. Grace had prepared breakfast, tidied the rooms, and got the boys ready for the family outing. Until then, nothing was out of the ordinary. But in the early afternoon, the businessman came downstairs with a heavy expression and asked her to pack her bags. He said that from that moment on, her services would no longer be needed. There was no room for questions or justifications. The wife, locked in the room, did not appear. The children didn't understand the reason for the rush, and Nathan, then 12 years old, just held his mother's hand while she collected old clothes and toys with teary eyes. No charges were filed, just a whisper that spread discreetly. They said that Grace had done something unforgivable, but no one knew exactly what, and those who knew never told. With her bags packed and her heart in pieces, Grace left the house with Nathan without looking back. None of the boss's children said goodbye, not out of malice, but out of orders. They were kept away from her that day, and silence became the rule even in the corridors. The widow, upon noticing that the employee had left, had the sheets changed in the service room, asked to remove all objects that reminded her of Grace, and prohibited her name from being mentioned again, and that was how the disappearance of two very present people was pushed into oblivion. Over time, the children grew up and assumed that Grace had done something wrong. They never questioned it. They never sought to know more. The official story was vague, but it was enough to make no one dare look for them. The memory faded along with the photographs removed from the shelves. And now, so many years later, Nathan reappeared in the same building where it had all started. He didn't bring a lawyer or demands. He entered the office with his head down, wearing simple clothes and a restrained posture. He carried no visible resentment, but he also showed no pride. There was a strange calm about him, like someone who knew their origins and knew that nothing there would be easy. The desk clerk recognized him vaguely, hesitating as he announced his name. And when Nathan entered the room where the will reading was taking place, all eyes turned to him as if they were facing a shadow from the past. No words were said, no greeting took place, but his presence was enough for everyone to know that the story was still far from over. The simple fact that Nathan was there was enough to bother more than any written clause. He remained standing near the door without trying to approach anyone. He did not show arrogance or submission. It was just a presence that screamed without needing to raise its voice. The widow, when she met his eyes for a brief moment, pursed her lips and looked away. She got up silently, slung her bag over her shoulder, and left the room briefly with stiff steps. No one dared to stop her. The lawyer started to continue reading, but the environment had already been contaminated. That figure standing near the entrance, dressed simply and with a firm gaze, dismantled years of imposed silence. No words were spoken, but everything had changed. Mark was the first to break the silence, questioning the reason for Nathan's entry at that moment. His voice didn't just carry doubt. There was pent-up anger, fear disguised as indignation. He tried to minimize the young man's presence by saying that it was theater, that he was now showing up out of interest. Some of the uncles agreed with discreet nods. Others averted their eyes. Nathan, however, remained motionless. He didn't respond. He didn't justify. He stood up straight with his hands clasped in front of him, as if he understood that he didn't need to prove anything at that moment. It was as if he knew that the weight of the truth would fall on its own, without him having to push. And it was precisely this silence that increased the tension within that stuffy room even more. As the accusations grew and nerves flared, the lawyer intervened. He asked for calm and explained that Nathan's presence had been directly authorized by the patriarch before his death. He said Nathan had the right to follow the reading, as did all the other heirs. This information caused astonishment. Until then, no one knew that the businessman had been in contact with Nathan. The possibility of a secret relationship between them dismantled the certainties that the family claimed they had. Nathan didn't react. He was still quiet, watching, but now with a slight hardening on his face. The environment was no longer the same. Something was about to be revealed, and the silence that enveloped the young man was not lost. It was the silence of someone guarding something great, something that was about to turn everything upside down. Mark couldn't stand the silence. He needed to assert himself in some way, to maintain control of the situation that was slipping through his fingers. He stood up, pointed at Nathan, and stated that this was a coup, a last-minute move to take part of an inheritance that did not belong to him. He called the young man an opportunist, accused the lawyer of connivance, and demanded the immediate suspension of the reading. The tone of his voice was already high, inflamed by the insecurity he was trying to hide. The lawyer, with the firm patience of someone dealing with delicate situations, got up from his chair and pointed to the signature on the will. He reinforced that the change had been made during his lifetime, registered personally by the businessman himself, at a well-known registry office in the city. There were witnesses, recordings, and all procedures had been strictly followed. The lawyer's statement did not silence Mark, but it reduced the strength of the reaction of others who until then shared the same indignation. Nathan then took a yellowed envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from carrying a weight that had waited many years to be shared. He handed the envelope into the hands of the lawyer, who opened it carefully. It was a handwritten letter, notarized, dated a few days before the businessman's death. Upon silently reading the first excerpts, the lawyer was visibly touched. He looked carefully over the lines before authorizing the content to be shared. He said that letter not only confirmed the family link, but also made it clear that Nathan was the biological son of the deceased. The document had been attached to the records at the time the will was modified. There were no doubts, no legal loopholes. The man everyone there was paying homage to had recognized in his own words who Nathan really was. The impact was silent, but profound. Anna put her hand to her chest. Some relatives looked at each other in confusion. The letter not only contained words, but also the silence of decades broken in a few lines. The lawyer had not yet read the details out loud, but he made it clear that there were feelings and regrets that were never said during his lifetime. Mark looked away, trying to maintain his posture, even though he felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. Nathan remained standing with his head high, but his moist eyes betrayed the burden of that moment. There was no pride on his face, just the firmness of someone who needed to be there. And although everything was said, no one seemed to know what to make of it. The past that had been swept under the rug was now screaming in front of everyone. And what else could arise from there was a doubt that no one dared to raise. The lawyer held the letter with both hands, his face serious, and his breathing contained. Before even starting to read, he warned that document was not just about inheritance, but something that the deceased considered unfinished. He began reading in a firm but sensitive voice. The businessman revealed that months before, Grace appeared asking for a job. The two had gotten involved in secret. She never demanded anything. She disappeared without saying she was pregnant. When she appeared at the door of the house with her belly already advanced, asking for a job as a nanny, he immediately recognized what that meant. He was married, with young children, and chose silence. He hired Grace with the excuse that he needed help with the children, but inside, he knew that he was facing the consequences of his own choice. The atmosphere became tense, heavy. The words spoken out loud opened dormant wounds. The businessman explained that Grace's removal was a direct demand from his wife, who had suspected it for years, but only became certain after finding old notes and observing Nathan's resemblance to his father. The pressure was immediate. Either Grace left or the family's life would fall apart. He gave in. He drove mother and son away without explanations, just with short orders and a futile attempt to appear indifferent. He said in the letter that it was the biggest mistake he made, that there wasn't a night when he didn't think about the cowardice of having denied his own blood. The change in the will was, according to him, a last gesture of recognition, not a favor, but a right that has always existed, even hidden by fear and appearances. Nathan remained motionless while the letter was read. He had already memorized those lines. He knew exactly what was being said, but hearing it in front of people who had always treated him like a stranger still provoked something he couldn't define. The letter ended by saying that Grace never told her son the truth because she preferred to spare Nathan the pain of being rejected, that she carried everything alone, while he pretended to keep control of the family he claimed to protect. Nathan only discovered what had happened 2 years earlier, when he found letters hidden among his mother's few clothes after her funeral. He discovered the origin, the silence, and the abandonment. And now, even with everything out in the open, it was impossible to know how that room would react to the truth the father had finally recorded with ink and gilt. After reading the letter, the room remained completely silent. No one moved. No one dared to break that moment. It was then that Nathan took a deep breath, looked ahead, and with a trembling and nervous voice, he began to speak. The words were jumbled, but firm. He said that when he discovered the truth about his origins, he spent weeks in a state of confusion. He alternated between revolt, disbelief, and an emptiness that only increased. He kept his mother's letters and torn notes in a shoebox, rereading everything several times until he understood that he wasn't delusional. He had known that face since he was a boy, from the newspapers, the magazines, from the words spoken in the house where he lived. But now, with the revelation out in the open, everything took on a new weight. He decided to write a simple letter without any demands, just saying that he knew. He didn't ask for a response. He just wanted the man to know that the son he hid had a name, a voice, and a story. And a few days before his death, Nathan received the answer that changed everything. His father's letter was brief, but it carried decades of silence and weight. He recognized Nathan as his son, stated that he had made a mistake in hiding for so long, and said that he was already taking steps to formalize what he never had the courage to say in life. It was this role that led the businessman to change the will. He called the lawyer, went to the registry office, recorded everything carefully and firmly. He wanted to make it clear that he was not pressured, that this was a personal and definitive decision. It was his last attempt to leave something fair for someone who spent much of his life between anonymity and rejection. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, he was looking for repair, a final act of dignity for those who never even received the right to exist within their own family. With the reading of the documents and Nathan's words still echoing, the atmosphere in the room dissolved. What was once anger turned into shock. What was surprise turned into discomfort. Mark, again, was the first to react, stating that it was absurd, that his father had been manipulated and that he would challenge everything in court. Anna remained silent, with teary eyes. The widow, already back in the room, did not react. She just kept her gaze lost somewhere on the table, without expressing approval or denial. The lawyer firmly informed that everything had been done within the law. Nothing there could be reversed. And in that moment, it became clear that what was at stake was not just money, but the wounded pride of a family that ignored for years someone who carried the same blood. And there was still a lot to be exposed. In the days following the reading of the will, the house was silent. The widow locked herself in her room, refusing visitors and ignoring phone calls. She spent hours sitting in front of the deceased's closet, surrounded by boxes, documents, and souvenirs. It was as if she was trying to silently understand the man with whom she had shared so many years. Among the papers, she found a shoebox with objects discreetly stored, letters dated more than 20 years ago, folded photos, notes in familiar letters. When pulling up an old photograph, the impact was immediate. Grace appeared younger, with eyes full of life, holding a newborn in her arms. It was Nathan, small, wrapped in a blue blanket. The image was yellowish, but the look between the two was clear. Here was the truth she had refused to see for so long. Meanwhile, Anna couldn't sleep. The eyes of the brother she barely knew never left her head. She waited until the third day after the meeting in the office, and without telling anyone, she went to the address left by Nathan at the registry office. She knocked on the door with a heavy heart. When he appeared, her reaction was that of someone seeing something that had always been there, but had only now become visible. They sat in silence for a while until Nathan began to recount. He spoke of his childhood in the back of the house, of the nights listening to Grace cry softly, of the times when he wanted to ask who his father was, but didn't have the courage. He spoke of the emptiness of not having a full surname on his birth certificate, of the hidden humiliations in schools, of the strength that his mother had to move forward without ever blaming anyone. Anna listened, with teary eyes and short breaths, feeling that something inside her was falling apart with each word. And you? Have you ever experienced a situation where the truth took a while to come to light? Or do you know someone who has also faced silence within their own family? Write here in the comments. Your story may inspire other people who are going through something similar. When Nathan finished, Anna took a while to speak. The words were difficult to come out, as if they had to cross a barrier that had been kept for years. She confessed that even without proof, she always suspected that there was something unresolved with Grace. She remembered her mother's looks, the harsh way she treated the employee, the discomfort at dinners where Grace was praised by a guest. She said she was ashamed of the complicit silence everyone had maintained for so long. She asked for forgiveness, not as an heiress, but as someone who grew up inside the lie constructed by adults. That visit didn't change the past, but it began to touch on something that the family never had the courage to face. Anna left there in silence, but with her chest full of something new, and she knew that from then on, other truths would emerge. The following days were marked by silent unrest within the family. The once noisy conversations became uncomfortable whispers in the hallways of the house. Little by little, the hatred that took over Mark's face began to lose strength. The absolute certainty that he had always carried began to crack inside, and he was no longer able to justify with such vigor the words spoken in front of Nathan's presence. Anna, with discreet gestures, demonstrated increasing compassion, and even their uncles, previously so confident, avoided giving their opinions. Grace's name, previously prohibited, began to appear between pauses and unresolved memories. Some people's faces closed in shame, others looked down. Guilt began to creep in, slow and uncomfortable, while pride tried to resist. In the midst of this turmoil, Nathan made a decision that no one expected. He asked to bring together his lawyer and those most directly involved in the inheritance and declared without hesitation that he would give up part of it. He said he didn't need the money to validate who he was. He wanted respect. He wanted his mother's story to be clean and recognized. He wanted the children of the man who denied him his last name to know that he wasn't there for revenge. He was there because he had been ignored for years, and yet he moved on. The lawyer tried to argue, but Nathan was firm. What he was looking for was not written on paper or measured in percentages. It was in the way people would look at him from now on, and that alone was enough. The gesture fell like a weight inside the room. Anna was immediately moved, but what surprised everyone was Mark's gaze, which previously only held harshness. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed Nathan in a different way. It seemed like something had changed there. For the first time, Mark did not see Nathan as a threat. He began to look at him as someone real, with pain, a past, and truth. Upon seeing his sister's reaction, his internal barrier began to crumble. The words of the letter came back to him, his mother's eyes avoiding answers for years, and his father's figure, always so adamant, now seemed smaller. There was something he needed to understand, something that had perhaps been overlooked for longer than he realized, and the search for these answers had barely begun. If you've made it this far and haven't liked this video yet, now is the time. This really helps the channel to continue bringing stories that move and transform. The like is free and makes all the difference. Shall we continue? Mark stared at a lost spot on the wall as if digging into his own memory. Suddenly he mentioned a childhood scene that had been buried by time, or perhaps by convenience. He said he remembered a day when he fell off his bike in the backyard, and the person who picked him up was not his mother, nor his father, but Grace. Anna, who until then had remained silent, completed the memory with details that not even he remembered. She said that Nathan, still small, had run to the kitchen to get a wet cloth and stayed by his brother's side until he stopped crying. Nathan smiled at the corner of his lips, and with a low voice, said that for him, in those days, everyone was siblings. There was no difference. They were just children sharing the same routine, the same toys, the same scolding. The mood in the room changed. Tensions slowly dissolved, and even though Nathan refused part of the inheritance, the family decided to keep the will exactly as his father had left it. This was now a collective decision, and more than money, it was a gesture of acceptance. A few days later, while Nathan was finishing up a session in the small studio where he worked restoring antique furniture, a woman appeared at the door. It was the widow. She was wearing discreet clothes and holding a small package in her hands. She didn't say anything when she entered. She walked over to him, held out the object, and just nodded with teary eyes. Nathan opened the package carefully and found an aged reliquary with a small image inside. It was from the time when Grace still lived with them. The photo was faded, but you could clearly see Grace holding Nathan in her arms and the family's 2 children at her side, smiling. Nathan held the reliquary for a moment without saying a word. The silence between them was more expressive than any sentence. There were no formal apologies or statements, just a gesture that came late but not too late. That same night, upon arriving home, Nathan placed the reliquary next to his mother's photo on a small shelf near the window. He turned on a soft light, took a deep breath, and spent a few minutes observing everything in silence. There was a trace of pain in his eyes, but also something new, almost light. It was as if part of the past had finally found rest. His voice was low but firm as he murmured a phrase he always heard from his mother. "My mother taught me that dignity cannot be bought, but today she was finally recognized." And at that moment, without needing to say anything else, the cycle was ended. Not with perfect justice, not with all wounds healed, but with possible peace. And for Nathan, that was more than enough. This story ends here, but the emotions it aroused can stay with you. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the value of truth, dignity, and reconciliation, then take this moment to click and like the channel, so you continue to receive stories like this which are emotional and make sense. In a little while, a recommended video just for you will appear on the screen, with another intense and unforgettable story, and soon after, a collection of several other transformative stories that are waiting for you. Click now and continue on this journey with us. There is still a lot of life to be told. Until next time.